The subject we want to talk to you tonight about is the terminology that appears in the mainstream media, television, newspapers, and in reporting on Israel, we think of media bias ordinarily as facts are wrong in a particular story, or they interviewed Arabs, they didn't interview Jews on a particular issue. What's important to realize is that the terminology in which all the reporting on Israel is done is not balanced. It has a lot of terms that are in very common use, even Jews use these terms, and we shouldn't, that convey to the public who are not as familiar with what's going on over there and what has gone over there for the past 3,000 years as we are, a misimpression of the rights to the land of the Arabs and the Jews respectively. The good news is that these loaded expressions were not written in stone 3,000 years ago. They are post-Israel independence creations. What I'd like to do real quick is go through 10 of these terms that you'll encounter almost every day when you read the newspapers or listen to the television or radio and reporting on Israel. The first expression that you'll sometimes hear the media say, Israel was created and founded in 1948, as though artificially and out of the blue. For example, they say, Syria and Lebanon gained their independence. India and Pakistan won their independence. But Israel was created, Israel was founded as if it was artificial and out of the blue. This leads to the second misleading expression, that what happened in 1948 was the war that followed Israel's creation. What actually happened in 1948, 1947, 1948 was that the United Nations attempted to partition the Palestine Mandate. For 400 years before the 1948 era, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, as you I'm sure know. And at the end of World War I, when Turkey was defeated by the Allies, the Ottoman Empire came to an end, and the Middle East was given over to mandates run by the League of Nations with the intention that they would become independent states. One of those mandates was called the Palestine Mandate, and it was entrusted to Great Britain, and Great Britain administered it between 1920s and 1947. At that time, in 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution called the Partition Resolution, attempted to partition Palestine west of the Jordan. East of the Jordan, which was originally part of the mandate, became the Hashemite kingdom of Transjordan. But west of the Jordan River, that part of Palestine was supposed to be partitioned between the Arabs and the Jews. There were at that time about 1 million Arabs in that whole area, that was all. And there were also 600,000 Jews. So when the media gives you the impression that the Palestinians, as they're called, were all Arabs in 1947, they were not. In any case, what happened was that the Jews accepted the partition, and the Arabs rejected it with an invasion that was an attempt to destroy the Jewish people in Israel. Just 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, they wanted to conduct another Holocaust. A homeland army of Jewish soldiers called the Haganah set back that invasion of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and other Arab states that tried to destroy it. So when they say Israel was created and founded, and the war that followed Israel's creation, what really happened was that the Arabs rejected partition and invaded for the purpose of destroying Israel, and it was thrown back by a homeland army of homeland Jews. That's pretty good for a nation that was just created and founded 24 hours before that invasion. The third thing that they say is that there are Palestinian refugees of the war that followed Israel's creation. The sense of this is that the Arabs were living there, the Jews came in, were created and founded, and threw the Arabs out. What actually happened was that in that invasion, in the era of that war of 1948 and thereafter, more Jewish natives of the Middle East were displaced from Arab lands and from Iran than Arabs left tiny Israel. So it was not a Palestinian refugee issue. It was a Arab-Jewish conflict refugee issue with refugees on both sides. And you will rarely see the media report that there were Jewish as well as Arab refugees. In fact, more Jewish than Arab refugees. And Israel absorbed the Jewish refugees, where the Arabs are still living in, quote, refugee camps. But the media keeps saying the dispute over the fate of the Palestinian refugees, as if there were no Jewish refugees. There was about 1 million Jews living in Arab lands in 1948. They'd lived there for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. They were all displaced, whereas the Arabs who left tiny Israel were about 500,000, even though they often say millions. Has the media's misportrayal of who the Middle Eastern people are gotten through to the public? Here's one example. The President of the United States, when he addressed the whole world from Cairo in June of 2009, said it is easy to point fingers for Palestinians to point to the displacement brought by Israel's founding. That's a total inaccurate view of what happened in 1948 and the thousands of years before 1948. The next misleading expression that the media is vulnerable to saying over and over: the UN sought to create Jewish and Palestinian states in the Palestine Mandate. They say it over and over again: Jewish and Palestinian states, separate states for Palestinians and Jews, Jewish and Palestinian states, and so on. The difficulty with this, in terms of perception, is that when you talk about dividing Palestine between Palestinians and anybody else, you're like talking about partitioning Pennsylvania between Pennsylvanians and anybody else. The sometimes planet Pluto between Plutonians and anybody else, particularly Jews. The United Nations did not actually use that perspective. What the United Nations said in the Partition Resolution of 1947 over and over again was not independent Palestinian and Jewish states, but independent Arab and Jewish states, over and over and over again. There's a tremendous difference between talking about partitioning Palestine between Palestinians and Jews and partitioning it between two existing populations that weren't that far apart in numbers, Arabs and Jews. Let's talk about the Palestinians for a minute. Did the United Nations even consider the Arabs of Palestine as the Palestinians? No, it didn't. What it talked about, that partition resolution, was a hope for establishing in Palestine a economic and social peaceful country between the two Palestinian peoples, not Jews and Palestinians. The Associated Press in 2011 even told the public once that during the mandate, Muslims, Christians, and Jews living in Palestine were all referred to as Palestinians. It is a great misfortune that the Jewish people, Israelis, and diaspora Jews have given up that name, Palestinian. David Bar-Ilan, the great editor years ago of the Jerusalem Post, in his Eye on the Media column, pointed out over and over and over again in that column in the Jerusalem Post, which, by the way, used to be called the Palestine Post, that during the mandate, institutions like the Palestine Orchestra, the Palestine Electric Company, and on and on and on and on, referred to Jewish institutions, not Arab institutions. It's a shanda on the Jewish people that we gave up our equity in the term Palestinian. Fifth misleading expression: Judea, Samaria, they don't call it that, but that's what it is, and other areas were, quote, captured by Israel in 1967. The Los Angeles Times, for one, loves to say, seized by Israel in 1967, as though they had no prior contact with that area. That's a heartland and a Jewish homeland. If you look at the history, going back from the end of the biblical era, when the Romans in 135 finally defeated the Jewish Bar Kokhba revolt, they were succeeded, the Romans who ruled until, with the Byzantines until 636, all those hundreds of years, they weren't Arabs. In 636, a foreign invasion took place between Arabs and the Byzantines. And the Arab dynasties took over and they held the land with some intervals until the Crusade of 1099. That's the only time that Arabs ever ruled Palestine themselves. And they were foreign Arabs. They weren't local Arabs. And Palestine was not an independent Arab country. It was part of an empire ruled by the Umayyads and the Abbasids and the Fatimids, but not by anybody else. And then came the Crusades, and the Crusaders were defeated by Turks, led by a Kurd. And then the Mamluks, after the Mongols did their invasion, the Mamluks, who were not Arabs either, they ruled Palestine and surrounding areas for over 200 years. And then Turks ruled for 400 years, up until the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was dismembered. So when you talk about Palestinians, you have to recognize that Palestine was never an independent Arab country in all of its history. And the only time that foreign Arabs even ruled it was between the Arabs defeated the Byzantines in 636 and the Crusades of 1099. The fact is that the next native state in the land of Israel, after the defeat of Judea in the year 70 by the Romans, and again defeat of Judea by the Romans in 135, the next native state after that in that land is the land of Israel in 1948, the state of Israel in 1948.